Welcome to Profiles in Purpose. This is your host, Dan Kostka. Today, we're doing something a little different because I'm actually in person with my guest. My guest is Marilyn Dyck, and we're at a cafe called Rosso Cafe in southeast Calgary. And I trust that the background noise just adds some nice ambience and isn't a barrier to hearing us. Thank you, Marilyn, for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
So, I've known you for about 30 years, I guess.
Oh, wow.
Almost 30 years, since my mid-20s.
Yep.
And I know you've been dedicated your whole life to working with young people. And before we talk about why you worked with young people, can you just tell us when you first started working with young people?
I don't think I really qualified as working with young people. It's just that I thought a lot about them. And I was always kind of a rebel. And so I really noticed young people that were rebels and respected them and understood them. And I think that it was more a thought process for quite a while. I was raised in a very fundamentalist context. I went to a Bible college when I was done high school, and I studied sociology at university. So it was at that point that I was truly connected to the concept of what everybody called juvenile delinquents. I was always indignant about that title. I was embarrassed that sociology thought it was a good name for them. But that's when I began to understand the context and how a context impacts young people, and how I began to understand how just like everybody else's kids they are, and that in the end, when people said, what's wrong with them, a lot of times it isn't anything wrong with them. It's adults in their lives that didn't succeed in helping them be who they really were.
So I know for 30 years you were involved with an organization called The Back Door, which then became The Doorway, and 20 of those years you were the director of the organization. For those people who've never heard of it, can you just tell the general concept, what its philosophy was and how it tried to help youth who were without a home?
The context of the dates of that happening were at the beginning of a food bank in our city, in Calgary, and it was noticed that young people could get food from the food bank, but they had nowhere to heat it or prepare it. So there was a philanthropist listening to those stories. The director told the media about young people not able to use food bank food, and we had a province who refused to believe there were any young people on the street, and it took a while for that to sink in. But in the end, the philanthropists offered the director of the food bank the opportunity to figure out a better way for society to help young people get off the street, because he understood they're not there because they want to be. They're there because life has landed them there. And so out of that, I was hired the day that I was interviewed. I was hired to help with that, and we had 6 months to create a concept. Our concept was community has a whole lot to offer to young people, and we wanted to create something that was so equal, a context that everyone was a person, and that community people offering that to young people would be them learning about the young people and the young people learning about mainstream society. And so we set up on a business strategy that young people could come to the back door, we called it. They could make plans for their steps off the street. We would reimburse them for that plan as a business transaction, a handshake for their plan. They did 8 a month, and so they built the steps toward where they wanted to head in their lives. Every transaction was initiated by themselves, and community people learned, and they learned that they're not bad people. They are just young people that got to where they were, and they wanted to be different, and community people, in accepting them for who they were able to encourage them on a daily basis to believe in themselves. You can do it. And that's the way it progressed. The whole concept was that community, ordinary people, have a great deal to offer young people that have been marginalized.
You mentioned a little bit about your upbringing. Looking back, do you think you always had a sense that you would end up in some way of serving others, that you wouldn't just be doing a job that's just about a paycheck, but that will be about helping people? Do you think you always had that part of you?
No, I don't think I did. I think I understood my parents helping people in a rural community, that kind of stuff. But understanding urban was something different. And I think that the perspective of a Baptist religion would be that there's a lot of judgment going on about who's worthy of who you help. And I think that I resisted that from the get-go. I didn't understand it. My parents would say they didn't do that, and I think they're right. But the general idea was you made a judgment call about who you help and who you don't. And I think that at that point in my life, I believed that young people were considered not worthy of being helped. And so I kind of focused on, I wonder what I could do to be helpful.
So if I hear you correctly, when you were growing up, there was an environment where there was a lot of judgment. There's one way to live, there's one way, certain values that take priority over others, and there's a structure and a rigidity there, and then you ended up working with young people where there couldn't be judgment if you were really going to help them and listen. Am I on the right track?
Yes. Yep. My parents dropped by now and then to where we were working with young people, but it was kind of a cautious visit.
And can you expand more on the value and importance of listening in your role, working so many decades with homeless youth? What role did listening play, and why was it so important to listen if you were going to have an effect on these young people?
I learned that the only way I could learn about their experience of our society would be to listen to them. And so essentially I spent 30 years of listening to young people articulate, storytell, complain, grateful when they could be. Young people talk about how they had experienced our society. And over the years, my conclusion has been that when people say, what's wrong with young people, I think the answer is adults. It's the failure of adults to be the people who nurture the growth of young people. There's a lot more to that. That's not a singular kind of idea, but it's the point, because so many children are hurt and damaged by adults.
What did all that listening teach you about young people?
Oh my goodness, I learned they are forgiving, unbelievably forgiving. They learn how to cope. They learn that they can do, actually in our context, I guess, has probably made it true, that they have the ability to do the same thing as anybody else. They can make a plan. They can make a plan that works. And at the beginning of that process for them, they had 2 years to work on that for each person. They couldn't believe, they were just surprised that they succeeded again and again in the choices they made toward their own goals. So it was a process of their learning, their capability, and our joy at witnessing that young people are warm to people who pay attention to them and care about them and listen to them. And so at the end of 30 years, I still believe that the most critical thing we can do with our children is listen to them.
I'd like to ask you a bit about the challenges you had getting support from the community. I remember when I interviewed you 25 years ago for a college magazine when I was studying journalism. I remember something you said that stuck with me, and you said, we're not a pretty face. And by that, I took it to mean that it can be sometimes a hard sell, that the young people were not looked upon favorably by a lot of people in the community, and maybe some other organizations found it easier to get the financial support you needed. Am I on the right track, and can you talk a little bit about that? What were some of the challenges to get buy-in from the community, and specifically to get the money you needed to keep running?
I think probably the bottom line would be the consistent perception of mainstream community would be that young people are bad. They've done things that are wrong. They would continue to do things that are wrong when they're living on the street. The community did not understand about how do you create your survival when you have no money, no place to live, no people that are on your side. It wasn't exactly a learning experience for us because we had already anticipated that that's how it would be. But the community, and still today, the stereotype of young people being bad people prevails. If they've done something wrong, well, obviously they did something wrong, so they have to suffer for it, with no understanding that they had no other option.
I think a lot of people maybe see issues in their community that they'd like to do something about, and maybe even start an organization, if they're really ambitious, to start an organization to address those issues. But there must be times where it's just really discouraging and hard to keep going. Were there times where you felt rather discouraged?
We never were discouraged with the young people. We were discouraged with the community. But when we started, the biggest barrier for the community for our strategy would have been that we paid people on a business handshake $15 for a plan, and they could use that $15 as clean legal cash, which they had not been able to access because you can't get a job and blah, blah, blah. So that the first legal cash that we gave them freedom to make a choice about what they did with that money. And it's like rejoining our economy because now they're producing activity into our economy, and even though people don't trust them anymore, that money is legal, and that's sort of like a beginning point for young people to participate in our mainstream economy.
And it's not hard to guess the knee-jerk response by people who aren't very informed about the issues. The knee-jerk response would be, you give young people or anybody on the street money, it's going to go straight into drugs, it's going to go straight into alcohol and cigarettes, things they don't need that are only going to make their problems worse. So how do you get around that? Yes, the young people were getting those rewards only in exchange for steps that they came up with themselves in conversation with your volunteers. They came up with the steps that would make a difference in their life. But once they had the money, they were free to do whatever they wanted with it. And of course, people who were considering donating would think, I don't want my money to go into drugs. So I assume that you heard that a lot?
I think there was one example that I've never forgotten. It was a young man who his stepfather said, I would rather light a $20 bill on fire than give you money. And his father said, if you want to get off the street, you have to figure out how to do it, and I am not going to help one bit.
That's, very unfortunate, but not surprising, perhaps. But just in general, what were the ups and downs of being involved with a nonprofit for so many years? What were the rewarding aspects, and what were the times where it felt a bit discouraging, if any?
I think one of our happy things about our whole strategy was that the community people that came to work inside the space as volunteers began to understand the realities of young people. And as we produced writing sometimes and learning opportunities for young people, there was a shift in their thinking about young people on the street. And that was probably our biggest joy in terms of what we were trying to do. And people would tell other friends, and people would be surprised at what they heard about all these great young people that were on the street. And they are great. They just have never had anybody tell anybody that they witnessed that before. And it was kind of like that. And so it became pretty joyful for us as a staff and volunteers to know that probably our biggest goal and treasure would be that young people trusted us, because for so long they've been discarded and criticized and alienated, and the fact that they trusted us and began to trust themselves and began to trust their own brains because their brains were working just fine. Nobody had ever told them that before once they were out there.
And can you talk a bit more about how you wanted the young people to feel when they came into the doorways, offices, or there's the space? Or how did you refer to the doorways location?
We use space a lot. Space is critical in life. If you think about it philosophically, we were a space. We were a safe space. We were not downtown. We were far enough away that we felt people that would be not in agreement with us or be trouble for us would not would not have access to us. So there was that, but we were still close enough for people who were still downtown living at that time could still come. So it was always a space. And I remember over the years, one day in particular, we had one staff, he was such a bright guy, and he had really embraced wanting to be one of the community people in the room. He said, "The space you have is really critical, isn't it, Marilyn?" And it is. It's the space that you create that's safe, it's warm, it's yours. When young people came to the doorway, they went straight to the binder that had all their planning in it. There was nothing in that whole space that wasn't their access. And I think that they came to feel a belonging there and a respect. Respect is probably the biggest treasure that we offered, was the respect for them to pursue their own goals.
On a personal level for yourself, what were some sacrifices that you had to make in order to be dedicated to public service all this time, in order to work on strengthening the community? Did you ever think about that? Like, was there a bit of a trade-off there? You're doing something meaningful, but you had to sacrifice in certain ways?
I never thought of that once. I was thrilled every day to go to the back door, to the doorway. It was just, for me, a treasure that I was able to be a person that smiled at everybody that came through the door and chatted over a cup of coffee, welcomed them, no criticism, no questions, just acceptance and freedom to start over. If yesterday didn't work, you start over on the next day, and it became just so nourishing to people to not be afraid to come in, but to know that no matter what happened, they still had a safe place and a new start every time.
You said that every day that it didn't feel like a sacrifice, that you were where you wanted to be, working with the people you wanted to work with. So that must mean that your actions were aligned with your own personal values. So what are those personal values that were motivating you every day to do what you were doing?
Maybe that's why I was so happy to go to work every day. I was so happy to be a person who accepted the people that walked through the door. It just broke my heart in a figurative way, at least, the way that society treats young people that are marginalized. They don't know how to treat them, so they just ignore them or whatever. It doesn't matter. It's the point that every day I could be somebody who gave someone a smile and who gave someone assurance that they were a valuable person, that kind of stuff. That was the joy of every day. I loved it.
Did the role of purpose come up in your conversations with the young people, or is the sense of living life like according to your values and a sense of purpose, is that more like a luxury when your basic needs are met? Do you know what I mean? Like, if a young person doesn't have a safe place to live or a job or even a path forward, they're not sure how they can get some stability in the future, is the idea of living with a sense of purpose almost like a luxury that they can't even address till later on in their life? Did that come up as part of the conversation with them? That why do they think they're here? What's the purpose of their life? What do they want to contribute to others?
I think that's too philosophical for where their lives were at. Most of every day would have been conversations about survival and in their goals to integrate back into the culture of mainstream society. It was about figuring out what that looked like. It's basic stuff. Nobody's got a philosophical track, I don't think. They think about a lot of ideas because they're young people, but the fact that their survival, they're going to be in survival for a long time because they've had to learn that on the street. Now they're having to learn what it takes to survive in mainstream, and that's about finding a job, and then that's about finding acceptance of who you are and all of those things. So and when we know them for those 2 years, those are the things that they're focused on.
For people who maybe don't feel that their work is particularly meaningful or that it doesn't help others, or they just wish they had a deeper sense of purpose in their life, what lessons would you say that your experience, serving others, what advice would you have for someone if they don't feel like they're really making a difference?
I think that I've narrowed my concept of making a difference as I've gotten older and more experienced with people. I think that I've also learned that the importance to individual people in your life is about smiling, is about saying hello, it's about listening well when somebody's telling you something. I think that's our job as humanity. Our society is so busy and so full of activity and bombarded with media and whatever. There's lots of research going on about how we are losing our humanity because we are so impacted by all of the noise that's around us. It's pulling back to our humanity, and our humanity is viewing each other as persons, and that has to be an intentional withdrawal from a lot of stuff that is so demanding around us in terms of our attention and our time, that what really counts with the humanity of another person is that you can look them in the eye and smile and say, have a good day. That's a gift to that person, and it's simple. And we are so pressured to be like whatever we've currently heard or listened to or whatever, when in fact the purpose of our humanity, I think, is to nurture one another in who we are. And for the most part, a lot of us haven't even had a chance to figure out who we are as persons. When do we do that, and how do we do that? And those kind of things rarely happen because people are so busy in their jobs, in their commitments, in the life that is surrounding them, that they don't have time to spend understanding what their purpose is. And as I've thought about purpose, I think that I've thought, I have to know myself before I know my purpose. That's a lot of years of thinking about it literally. But I think when you know yourself, then you can recognize things that matter to you. And then you can take time to help the lady up the steps to her house and put her groceries inside. Things like that are gentle, obvious ways of being there for somebody else. And I think at the end of the day, maybe our catch-all of our purpose would be how we impact the space and time and people that we're with.
It really sounds like being there for others is very central to your sense of purpose. Are there times that you can recall when you were working with young people that stand out in your memory where you thought, we're on track or we're connecting with these folks?
Oh, many times. It's just every day. It's like when you engage with people in a meaningful hello. Hello is meaningful. How are you? How did this work for you? That kind of stuff. It's all caring. It's letting them know that you see them and that you support them no matter what happens. If something doesn't work, like I said, there's other ways to do it. But the value of the person, they recognize their value in seeing you paying attention to them. And I think that in the big picture, our role in humanity should be to recognize each other and who we are. One of the things that happened in our space that I will never forget, a young woman had come in because she had heard about the back door and the opportunity to make plans to change her life. she sat down at a table with me, and it's a round table and the chairs are high, and it was my favorite table. Anyway, she started writing down her concept of what her goals would be, and she said, "Do you mean in this place that I can just think about my own life and think about what I can do to accomplish where I want to take my life?" And she started to cry, and she said, "I have never been in any place that said they could help me where they let me think about my own life. They were busy telling me how to do my life. They weren't listening, and they weren't giving me space to think for myself." I've never forgotten that. And so when you think of, I recently had a reason to read some neuroscience. When you think of how critical it is that people have autonomy and agency and are able to think for themselves, we have structures and programs that push them through our ideas of what they should be doing, when in fact what they need is a quiet space, acceptance, and time just to figure out who they are and how they want to proceed. And as they take those steps, they can know what they want to change and what they want to add to, but it's their autonomy and their agency, and there's nothing more important than agency for people to manage their lives.
And finally, before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you, when you think of the young people that you met over the years through the doorway, what are some things that you hope the participants would say about you and the difference you made for them?
I think that overall, the main thing about me would be that they were accepted as who they are and not judged.
Well, Marilyn, it's been wonderful speaking with you. It's been a real pleasure, and as I mentioned earlier, I first met you 25 years ago or so as a young college student, and I've stayed in touch all this time because I was always impressed by your dedication to young people and just serving others. You've been a real inspiration for me, and I'm sure you have been for many others, and hopefully some new people who listen to this will also be inspired by your example. So thank you so much for your time.
Really appreciated the opportunity. I think, as old as I am now, I think that the simplest things in life are the most critical. A smile is simple, and just sitting down and listening to somebody is simple. But it could be one of the most important things you ever do, is listen to somebody. I think that at the end of the day, the most valuable thing that we can ever do in our lives, the gold part of how we can contribute to the world, is if we pay attention to the people that are in the same space we are. That means really seeing them, not because you have an opinion about them, but just really seeing them. And really listening, which means you don't say anything. You close your mouth and you listen and you think with them, but you learn because you're not busy manufacturing responses in your head. You're just listening. All of the years that I've spent with people, I hear the feedback over and over again that you listen to me, and that makes all the difference. It doesn't take them anywhere except to themselves. If you talk while they're talking, you don't learn from them. When you are quiet, you allow them to think as well as talk, and that's how they learn about themselves as well.
Thank you again. Take care.